Welcome to Talking History, a series of talks from the Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern group. Please note, the views expressed in this talk are representative of the views held at the time of the material being discussed. They do not necessarily represent the views of the speaker. The Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern group, nor the team at the Mr. T podcast studio. In this talk, we hear from Robert Sykes, who tells us about the 1832 Reform Bill, and also asks whether it avoided a revolution.
I start out with two statements. One is that the parliamentary system in Britain is genuinely old, but democracy in this country is not old. Arguably, it's only 100 years since we had something that was effectively democracy, if you define that as one person, one vote. What I'm going to be talking about is the first significant reform, not the last reform, but the first significant reform of that parliamentary system. And what I'm going to do is spend a little bit of time on the unreformed system, why it needed changing, the growth of a reform movement of people who wanted to change the way Parliament was set up, the reform crisis itself, which is really 1830 to 1832, when there was a large degree of political excitement involving a very large number of people, an unusual event. The Reform Parliament itself, what it was, what it did, and then a little bit about the longer term perspective of political reform after 1832. And that was where we come to the rather tabloid subtitle, Avoiding Revolution. Britain is unusual in Europe and unique in Western Europe of not having had a modern day revolution. Why not? Is effectively the question. Many years ago I did a PhD in history, and it was about the early 19th century and political movements then. So I'm going to do a little bit of a case study of what I did, which is centred on Manchester, shock city of the Industrial Revolution. However, I stopped doing all of that 35 years ago when demands of job and family took over. So I used to know an awful lot about this and be able to talk without notes. I'm going to find out today this morning whether I can do it with notes or not. The parliamentary system in England goes back a long way. It then didn't change as England changed. I should say this talk is mostly about England. Wales and Scotland had similar, if parallel, reform acts. The unreformed system, each county had 2 MPs, irrespective of the size of its population. Rather like the US Senate, actually. But Yorkshire, with 20,000 voters, had 2 MPs. Rutland, with less than 1,000, had 2 MPs. It's not an ideal situation, but one that gave representation to different bits of the country. The qualification to vote in the counties was called 40 shillings. You don't need to be bothered about the money. What that meant is middle class and above. It excluded sort of working class people. Voting in England's 203 boroughs, those are the towns, was determined by a large number of different approaches according to how things were set up back in the Middle Ages. A small number of boroughs had quite large number of voters. The best named are the Potwalloper boroughs. And a Potwalloper borough was where the vote was given to every male head of household with a hearth large enough to boil a pot. And an example was Preston in Lancashire. This is from the Times in 1830, by the way. The 2 candidates, how wonderful it is that all people can have the vote in this way, that you can act independently and so on. Never mind him, I'll give you something to put in your pot, i.e. I'll bribe you for your vote. because with no ballot, people's voting was open to everyone. For good or for worse, there were a number of areas where a lot of people, including working class people, had the vote. More common was the so-called rotten boroughs, which were places set up to elect MPs in the Middle Ages that had changed. An example is Dunwich in Suffolk. It was created as a parliamentary constituency in 1296 and was then a thriving port with 2 MPs. It then fell into the sea, quite literally. Erosion took it out. So in 1831, there were only 44 houses there. It still elected 2 MPs. One was the Downing family, who chose an MP from their own ranks. The other was the Duke of Newcastle, who was sold the right to nominate an MP for £1,000 at election. Why they paid £1,000 is because there were rich pickings to be made if you were on the inside of the political system. Old Sarum is where Salisbury used to be. Old Sarum also had 2 MPs. Many of these MPs were in reality the sons of various landowning families. And roughly 360,000 people had the vote in broad terms. The big new cities of the Industrial Revolution, almost all of them didn't have an MP. The biggest are Manchester and so on. Quite a lot of boroughs had less than 300 voters and 56 had less than 50 voters. So if you were sitting in Manchester with a population of going on to 200,000 and growing rapidly, you would have felt this wasn't right. There were reasons that were advanced in support of this system. One of them was that for these rotten boroughs, where effectively a landowning family or the Crown or the governing party could name the MP, was it got able young people into the Parliament. Although on the face of it, it was pointless and a rather silly situation. There was no ballot, so hence there was bribery. General elections only every 7 years. What that system produced is roughly half of the MPs in the House of Commons owed their position to a patron, usually a landed aristocrat. Fewer than a third of elections were even contested because there was no point, because the result was known beforehand. From roughly the 1770s onwards, you get the beginnings of a quite significant movement for reform. It got underway after the loss of the American colonies. The sheer incompetence of the aristocratic government was laid bare. What would have happened if they hadn't won independence? In the 1790s, you get the first working class radical societies. And you get the beginnings of radical movement that was modern in the sense it wasn't a riot, it was a clear, fairly modern approach to politics. But then there's the French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleonic Wars and repression. Various acts were passed to suppress all political activity. 1815 to 1820, immediately after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, you get a strong revival of radicalism and reform activity. There's 3 key demands. Universal suffrage, which means one man, one vote. It does mean one man, it didn't mean one woman. But we actually know that many of the radicals themselves agreed with the idea of voting rights for women, but it was difficult enough to try and get it for men, let alone for females as well. So it was a bit of a non-starter. Although in the 1790s you get the first serious books and so on about female suffrage. So universal suffrage, one man, one vote. Annual elections, which sounds a bit much, but actually the idea was the same idea of recall that we have now. That if the MPs not behaving themselves, you get rid of them after a year. It didn't envisage that most would change, but there was the opportunity there. And then vote by ballot, so that rich people couldn't pressurise poor people, basically. There were 2 sort of leaders. Our very own William Cobbett. Cobbett was a journalist and a writer, Started out life as a Tory, but by 1815 was firmly a radical, and that's what he was when he died. I say a writer. What happened with Cobbett's writings is you read them, but they were also read out in pubs and in chapels and so on. The readership, so to speak, was much larger than the circulation. So Cobbett, he wasn't really a leader of the movement, but he was one of the two most prominent spokespeople. And the other was Henry Hunt, jumping back a few years to Peterloo. Big reform movement meeting in Manchester in August 1819, which was attacked by the local forces of law and order. And Hunt was the great orator, spoke in front of large meetings. We think probably 60 to 100,000 people were there in St Petersfield in Manchester when they were attacked. Shortly after that, the people who organised the meeting were jailed. The people who led the attack were promoted into various points, and the so-called 6 Acts were put in place, which again repressed things. So for the 1820s, it all went quiet. Repression, failure of the reform movement to that day, relative prosperity in the 1820s, and an entrenched government. Lord Liverpool was the Tory Prime Minister from 1812 to 1827 and seemed immovable for many years. You then get his resignation, age and ill health, really. You get instant splits in the Tory party, 2 different prime ministers within the space of a couple of years, and then the Duke of Wellington becomes prime minister. Highly skilled general, lousy politician. He was very rigid, very old-fashioned in his approach, and didn't judge things that well. Daniel O'Connell and the Catholic Association. After the Act of Union, Ireland was part of Great Britain, but Catholics were not allowed to be MPs, as they were not allowed to be many other things. You got Daniel O'Connell, who organised this campaign for Catholic emancipation, for Catholics to be treated the same as Protestants. And in Ireland, in County Clare, he gets himself elected, but he can't serve as an MP. Faced with the reality that virtually all of Southern Ireland would elect Catholic members of Parliament who then couldn't sit in Parliament and made a nonsense of it, the Tory government under Lord Liverpool surprised people by emancipating the Catholics. The key other person in the government was Robert Peel. Both of them went against what they really thought, but it was practical, pragmatic politics to do it. What you then got was some of the most old-fashioned and ultra-Tories saying that, well, maybe we do need reform, because any system that will enfranchise Catholics has got to be bad. The extent to which that Protestant-Catholic divide still mattered, Catholics were the enemy. They were Spain and the Armada and so on, and that was a very strong tradition. So Catholic emancipation was shattering sort of Tory unity. You also got poor harvest and trade depression. And when people are not feeling very good about things, that tends to be when you get protest. So, the events of the reform crisis. Really the big impetus came from Birmingham. Birmingham Political Union was formed in 1830. This was a political organisation to get an extension of the franchise and MPs for places like Birmingham and Manchester and so on. Swing riots are in the countryside, not particularly political, but a sign of things that were going seriously wrong in the country. And I'll come back to that. July 1830, you get a revolution in France, and that's hugely influential to people wanting to move on in England. The reason being that the revolution in France was a limited one that established a constitutional monarchy. It didn't go really radical. It didn't go the route of the first French Revolution to terror and so on. And people got the idea you could change the political system without risking revolution. The lesson many Tories had learnt from 1789 and France is that any reform is going to lead to revolution. And that really is questioned by that July 1830 event in France. General election in July 1830, change of monarch. There were significant gains, but still a Tory majority. Then in November 1830, when there is a lot of political support for the idea of reform, the Duke of Wellington says thus, as reported in Hansard. He, that means the Duke of Wellington, was fully convinced that the country possessed at the present moment a legislature which answered all the good purposes of legislation, and this to a greater degree than any legislature ever had answered in any country whatever. He would go further and say that the legislature and the system of representation possessed the full and entire confidence of the country. Quite a serious misjudgment of the popular mood, where people were beginning to expect some sort of reform. It becomes clear that he's massively misjudged things, and he resigns in November 1830. Swing riots, a little bit more about them. For long-term trends that I don't really want to get into, there was increasing poverty in the rural areas of southern England, lower wages, and then the introduction of threshing machinery that took away jobs. And you get an outbreak of anonymous letters signed by the mysterious Captain Swing, threatening arson attacks and so on the large-scale landowners and farmers. Serious events. I mean, to give you an idea of the scale of this, there were trials by special commission. 252 people were sentenced to death for involvement in that. 19 were actually executed, 500 were transported, 600 were jailed. The countryside then really bows out of the reform movement's story because political consciousness in the countryside wasn't great. Earl Grey, leader of the Whigs, was asked to form a ministry. He was a long-term reformer, going back to the 1790s, and he had an aim. I think it says a lot in very few words. The reform has to be large enough to satisfy public opinion and to afford sure ground of resistance to further innovation. The Whig aristocracy that came in and formed that government were not Democrats. The idea was to be a reform that would bind the middle class to the upper class. It was to postpone democracy and not to encourage it. Sure ground of resistance to further innovation. Grey actually said in Parliament that he was an opponent of universal suffrage. And there was a dilemma there between that stated aim of the Whigs, because they didn't hide it in Parliament, and those outside Parliament who were inclined to support the idea of reform, but they were supporting it because they wanted it then to continue and grow, whereas the Whigs were wanting the exact opposite. March 1831, Lord John Russell presents the bill to the House of Commons. Most of the government were in the House of Lords, of course, in those days, but they acted through the House of Commons. Robert Peel, who was already emerging as the most significant leader on the Tory side, declared the bill to be a revolution. He was quite influential in terms of the direction things moved. Main provisions of the reform bill that was introduced. For the first time, there's a bit of a footnote, it said that women couldn't vote. There were a very few cases in the old unreformed system where women effectively did vote, because the vote was tied to property rather than the person. So there were a few exceptions, but there were very few. But after 1832, there were none. Russell's bill was much more extensive than people were expecting. People expected a little bit of fiddling, getting rid of the worst rotten boroughs, giving a few MPs to places like Manchester and Birmingham. But it was much more extensive than that. Voter qualification was fixed at a level. You had to be a serious farmer, shopkeeper to qualify for the vote in the counties. In the boroughs, quite a lot of boroughs were abolished and new boroughs were created with either 2 MPs or 1. Voting qualification, £10 per annum value. Again, don't worry about the money. What that meant in real terms was that a small master craftsman employing about 7 or 8 dozen people probably would just about get the vote. Most working people would not. Shopkeepers, innkeepers would get the vote, and then above that there'd be professionals and so on. It was quite carefully drawn where that line would be. A little bit about Manchester. How do we know what happened back there? Well, in those days in Manchester, there were no less than 5 Manchester newspapers. The Manchester Guardian, which evolved into the present-day Guardian, but in those days was a very cautious liberal paper, not a radical paper at all. The Courier, a conservative paper, Chronicle, which was Anglican Whig, the Times, which was middle-class reformer paper, and the Manchester and Salford Advertiser, which was a radical newspaper, which was unusual in those days. And if you put those 5 together, you can work out more or less what happens. It's quite funny reading it sometimes, because if it's a radical meeting, the Whig and Tory papers will say there's less people at it than the radicals will say, and vice versa. And I came across in the original stuff someone who wrote for more than one newspaper, coming up with different numbers of people at the meeting for the same meeting for different newspapers. 3 radical papers, Voice of the People, which was a trade union generated newspaper, quite an innovator. Cobbett's Register still going, and the Poor Man's Guardian, which was an ultra-radical paper, an illegal one in fact, which took the line that the bill being presented was a trick to thwart democracy, and that became linked with Henry Hunt, and I'll come back to that. You have no police system in the modern sense. What you have is magistrates in localities who write letters into the Home Office and sometimes employ spies and informers to find out what's going on. And you get published memoirs of people. Manchester is different from Birmingham. The strikes set the context, quite firm class division. But in Manchester you get the beginnings of an interest in reform when William Cobbett tours the country and Henry Hunt tours in August 1830. He's in Manchester on the day of the anniversary of Peterloo, an enormous meeting, parades round the town, goes and boos at the mills of the Burley family, Burley being the person who led the charge at Peterloo, and a lot of political excitement. A Manchester Political Union is formed, but also a reform committee of the richer mill owners. And what happens in Manchester is you get parallel developments. You don't get a unified reform movement because of that class division. Hunt tours after he wins the Preston by-election. The atmosphere has changed, so Preston, although a potwalloper borough, in the gift of one family really most of the time, but that all changes. Hunt, therefore, is in Parliament listening to what the Whigs are saying, and he starts criticising the bill. Cobbett criticises Hunt, and Hunt criticises Cobbett back, and you have 2 of the biggest egos in history, and they go at each other. But there's rival political basis to this. Cobbett is a gradual reform is worth having. Hunt is saying, well, this is a trick to actually thwart at what we really want. PUWC was a political union of the working classes. You had separate organisations for working people and the Reform Committee for middle-class people. National event, there were 3 reform bills. The first one was defeated in the House of Commons, prompting a general election. Huge gains for reformers. Grey now had a Commons majority of over 130. It could get this bill through the Commons. It's thrown out by the House of Lords by 41 votes in October, and that produces spontaneous reactions in the country. What mostly happens is in some towns, not places like Manchester and Birmingham, which, by the way, but in Nottingham, The day after the bill is rejected by the House of Lords, you get an attack on the property of anti-reformers. That included Nottingham Castle, which was set on fire. That was the seat of the Duke of Newcastle, who just before this had been busy evicting pro-reform tenants. That's why he's picked on. The army eventually stopped this after a couple of days. Biggest riots were in Bristol. 3 weeks after the House of Lords vote, the arrival of an anti-reform judge to open the assizes. A riot starts, the lieutenant colonel in charge of the army puts it down, but then takes the army back to barracks. The riots then became really serious. 12 killed, 102 arrested, 4 executed. Serious but spontaneous violence, not linked together as a movement. Manchester, different. You don't get spontaneous riots. There's a more sophisticated approach to politics, which involves being organised and also effectively being peaceful. There's a big protest meeting against the House of Lords, and it gets overrun by the radicals. What happens in Manchester is crowds go round the streets, stopping all the cotton mills. It happens peacefully, there's no damage to the mills, but they're stopped. And you get a vast number of people turning up to a protest meeting, which is then adjourned to the outside. The radicals carry a majority for universal suffrage and not the bill. The Reform Committee, which had been organised in the original meeting, we know was a dread of commotion, and we know that because Absalom Watkin, one of the members of that Reform Committee, published his journals. There's talk of revolution. If you get a sense of what the country must have felt like with things like those riots, but things like Manchester and Birmingham with enormous meetings of popular opinion in favour of some sort of reform. And the countryside still smarting from things in terms of the swing riots. The radicals talk about holding a national convention, echoes of the French Revolution. But really they're in a tactical dead end. It's proving difficult enough to get a reform such as the Whigs are proposing, let alone one that went further. Hence tactical dead end. And then in December 1831, the third reform bill is published, and in most cases people are going to wait to see what happens with that. But the Political Union of Working Classes in Manchester started organising meetings on a Sunday, saying that that was the only day that working people could attend the meetings. This is seen as outrageous at the time. On the second one, there's a great apparatus of the army called out and special constables sworn in and so on. And 4 of the leaders are arrested. Large crowds in the vicinity who boo this. They don't attack the forces arresting. They are peaceful. They're not behind the Huntite people who are criticising the bill, but there's sympathy for them. And 4 people end up in jail for a year simply for organising a meeting on a Sunday. Nationally, the issue is what happens if the Lords reject the bill again. They've seen what happens the first time. What's going to happen if that happens again? The 7th of May, government defeated by 45 votes. Massive protest meeting in Birmingham. 8th of May, the Cabinet decides it will resign if the King does not agree to the creation of new Lords for the House of Lords. It's in the gift of the King, William IV, to create new Lords, to create a majority to get the Reform Bill through the House of Lords. But he doesn't want to do it because it brings the whole thing into disrepute. The King declines the idea. The Whig government resigns. The King asks the Duke of Wellington to form a government. Further Birmingham meeting, huge protest, the major criticism of the Queen, who is German, will you believe, and that point is made quite forcibly. 12th of May, London's placarded with signs, "Stop the Duke, go for gold." A run on the banks to stop the Duke of Wellington forming a government. It is quite clear there was a degree of political excitement that we in our age would find it quite extraordinary. Politics matters when you're the underdog. It's like, if you remember, in South Africa when the vote was finally granted, queues of people to vote. Something that matters. In our rather apathetic age, where quite a lot of people don't even bother to vote, it's sometimes hard to grasp how important it is. Stop the Duke, go for gold. Because that was being said by some seriously rich middle-class people, it seemed a threat. And we know with Liz Truss, that can be a threat to a government. A petition for the City of London, which even then was the economic banking centre, was important. Not much of a run actually happened, but that was really because on the 17th of May, 10 days after the defeat, Wellington gives up attempting to form a government. He can't get sufficient people prepared to actually go this way. And the crucial person was Robert Peel, his second in charge from the Tory government just before the Reform crisis. The Whig cabinet meets. The King sends them a letter saying that he will create sufficient new lords in order to get the bill through. In the end, that doesn't need to happen because the opponents of the bill absented themselves. So Wellington and other people just weren't there when the bill passed the third reading in the Lords. You get the first general election under this new Reform Act in December 1832. Quite a few months later, the Whigs win a large majority. What was happening in Manchester? In May, when the Whig government resigned, huge protest meeting in the open air. The Reform Committee and the Political Union of the Working Classes confer about the resolution. And the resolution says they really want universal suffrage, but will take the bill as a first instalment. The middle-class reformers don't really want to do that, and we know that because of the diary of this Absalom Watkin, who was a member of that committee. He said the thing was a triumph for the radicals, getting the reformers to say they'd want full universal suffrage. But then the Whig government comes back in, the bill is going to go through, and at that point, the middle-class reformers bow out. Absalom Watkin records they were charged with inconsistency and desertion. And for the years immediately afterwards, that became the radical viewpoint, that they were betrayed in 1832. That 1832 Reform Act, which they supported as a first instalment, that isn't what happened. But there's a tactical dilemma. It's difficult enough getting this reform bill through. How would you get something even more radical through? Long election campaign by the radicals for Cobbett in Manchester. There's a paradox here, but that relates to political understanding and political consciousness. Cobbett is a man of the south and of the rural areas, but the rural areas don't feature very strongly in this story. The agricultural labourers were not really part of this, and that's a worldwide phenomenon. Radicalism tends to be rooted in the towns and the cities and the industry, not in agriculture. Cobbett stands for two constituencies, Manchester and Oldham. He loses in Manchester. Hunt loses in Preston. Preston, which could have elected a radical MP before, there's less people voting in Preston now than there were then, and Hunt's beaten. In special circumstances, Cobbett wins in Oldham, but that's because the opponents are tainted with slavery. It's a rather special case. A few quotes, I'm sort of summing up now, observation. Thomas Creevey, a diarist, about the Queen. Her fixed impression is that an English revolution is rapidly approaching, and that her own fate is to be that of Marie Antoinette. We think there was genuine fear that this is what could develop. That isn't remotely what happened, but could it have been what would have developed if Wellington had formed a government and tried to press ahead in the face of overwhelming public opinion? Three historians, Eric Evans, who was professor at Lancaster, and who's written a couple of books about this, saying Britain has never in modern times been closer to revolution than in the autumn of 1831. Edward Thompson, who wrote the Making the English Working Class book, specifies the autumn of 1831 and also the days of May, when that 10 days when the Whig government was in abeyance. Eric Hobsbawm, the third historian, is probably more cautious, probably the only one in modern history where something not unlike a revolutionary situation might have developed. I.e., it didn't qualify as a revolution what actually happened, but what would have happened if resistance had continued. The Reform Parliament met in early 1833. The leading aristocrats who dominated the cabinet were in the House of Lords rather than the House of Commons. Next is an opportunity for those who in rock music know the words to certain songs by The Who. Meet the new boss. What's next? Same as the old boss. The government after the Reform Act was as aristocratic and landed-based as the government beforehand. The Prime Ministers were Earl Grey followed by Melbourne. There was no change in who was at the top, which of course had been the aim of the Whigs. What does this new Reform Parliament do? Well, it votes down the 10 hours bill. This was a bill factories would have to shut down after 10 hours, 6 days a week. You think of that, what 10 hours at work would have meant. But in the interest of free trade, it's voted down. Slavery is abolished, but there's generous compensation to the slave owners. Thirdly, it passes the Poor Law Amendment Act. This gets Cobbett in particular furious, but it's an ancient law providing for the poor that gets changed, and you have the dreaded workhouse and so on. Not a law, but a prosecution of the agricultural workers who form a union. And 6 of them, the so-called Tolpodle martyrs, are transported to Australia for forming a union. Refuses further parliamentary reform. So what you have is a new reform government doing things that poor people see as an attack on them. What happens with the Conservatives? Well, Peel issues a so-called Tamworth Manifesto, which is a manifesto in the constituency he stands for. But basically what you have there is pragmatic, moderate conservatism, accepting change, not trying to roll it back, but being cautious about future change. And Peel sets the Conservatives off on a route. And there's a real paradox here, considering how they'd been before the Reform Act. It didn't take that long before the Conservatives win a general election in 1841, and Peel becomes Prime Minister. Would you have expected that, given their unpopularity before the Reform Bill gets through? There's some significant dates about further parliamentary reform and politics. 3 dates, 1839, 1842 and 1848. Those are the Chartists' petitions for universal suffrage, votes for all. What's 1867? Second Reform Act. Middle-class men in towns getting the vote. 1872? Protection for the poor in voting, the ballot. After 1872, private voting. 1884, male householders in the counties. 1918, female suffrage, immediately after the First World War, but not on equality with men. Because if you did it on equality of men, the men would have been in a minority because of the sheer death rate of the First World War. 1928, all adults over 21. Democracy, if it means one person, one vote, started in this country in 1928. It didn't start in the Middle Ages. A few more statistics. Percentage of all adults entitled to vote. Changes are incremental. Probably the easiest, most relevant is the adult males entitled to vote. Roughly speaking, after the first Great Reform Act, it was 1 in 5 men had the vote. 1918 On to 1928, it isn't quite 100% because there was a resident qualification, but it's near to it. 1948, abolition of plural voting. Universities, Oxford and Cambridge, and in certain circumstances, if you owned a business in another constituency, you could vote in more than one place. 1969, age of voting reduced to 18. Quite a lot of debate at the moment whether it should be lower still, and different views on that. Who was right, Cobbett or Hunt? Hunt said to people what the Whigs were saying in Parliament. On the other hand, was it not a bit of a tactical dead end to say what we want is the votes for all when we can't even get the moderate reform through? And there's an ongoing issue to this day about which route you take. Did the Reform Act advance or delay achieving democracy? Earl Grey wanted sure grounds of resistance to further change. Is that what happened? Did it set a pattern of gradual change which avoided revolution? Is that the thing that makes Britain different? Most of Western Europe had revolutions in the 19th century. Britain didn't. Longevity and success of the monarchy. Not particularly popular at the end of the Georges, seen as parasitic in many respects. But after 1832, increasingly you have the monarchy acting as a constitutional monarchy and staying out of politics. And then the paradox, the Conservative Party grows out of the Tory Party. The Tory Party is stuck in the rut, anti-reform position before 1830, emerges as a success story. The most successful political party in Western Europe, if you take longevity and number of years in office. Real paradox there. Then finally, was it a revolutionary situation? People were upset, certainly, but was it a revolutionary situation?
This podcast has been produced by the Mr. T Podcast Studio in association with the Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern Group. Thank you very much for listening to this talk.